Thank you all so very much for coming today. Very excited to have two brilliant guests on the stage here today. I'm going to start with Professor Muthukumaran. I was going to say doctor, but he has been upgraded to a new Professor Muthukumaran. He's Professor of World History at the National University of Singapore and also the co-author of the exhibition book. He's been brilliant to work with. And also William Dalrymple. I mean, he doesn't really need much of an introduction. Best-selling author, including of this wonderful book, The Golden Road. And just to highlight, after this event, if you go out of these doors and go left, William will be available to sign copies of his book as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to William for the presentation, and Suresh and I will just sort of discreetly exit stage briefly. Leave you to it. Okay, thanks very much.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be in this reading room where I wrote one of my first books, in Xanadu, was partly written in this reading room, as of course much grander works like Das Kapital, I think, was written here by Karl Marx at an earlier phase. And I, to be honest, haven't been back in here since the Great Court was opened. I didn't know where it had gone. I hadn't realized it was inside the roundel. Anyway, I'm just going to give a half an hour run through the ideas in my book, The Golden Road, which chime very closely with the wonderful exhibition that Sushma and Suresh have curated. I hope you've all seen it, and if you haven't, go and see it. Or if you have, go and see it again, because it's a spectacular show. There are debates among scholars about ancient trade routes, and this exhibition takes a line which very much trims its sails in the same direction as my book, and which is a slightly different take to the one presented here at the British Museum last year in the Silk Road show. They're not mutually incompatible, but they definitely have differences of emphasis, because for the last 40 years, this idea of the Silk Road has been very popular for the very good reason that it is a wonderfully simple but attractive idea of a road linking east and west, linking the Mediterranean with the South China Sea. That there was once a way of crossing Asia that allowed you with some ease to travel from one world to the other. And it's an idea which works on a scholarly basis. It's been the basis for many exhibitions, including the one last year in the British Museum. But it was kicked off by an exhibition at the Met, then in the National Gallery of Art in Washington in the 1980s, which really started this rebirth of the idea of a Silk Road. It is not a phrase you find in any classical source, Western or Eastern. Marco Polo never talks about the Silk Road. And it's also, I think, a notion which needs to be critiqued in terms of timing, in that I have no problem with an idea of this line existing after the Mongol conquest, when Marco Polo rams a fist through the middle of Asia, breaks through the Persian Empire, and creates an empire which does indeed span from the Mediterranean to the South China Sea. It is much more questionable whether you can reflect that route back into classical antiquity as maps such as this do. This was taken at random from the 40-odd books on the Silk Road published in the last decade. And here you see very much a classicizing names like Alexandria, Gaza, Tyre, Palmyra, Petra. These are places which were at their peak in the Roman period, or the early Byzantine period. But we do actually not know of a single merchant who traveled from China to Rome, or from Rome to China during that period. It's entirely speculation, not one diplomatic mission, not one merchant. In fact, it's unclear whether Rome and China even had more than the foggiest notion of each other's existence. We do not have, it may be that the Chinese sources are referring to Rome when they talk about Da Qin, which is a power in the far west. And it may well be that when late Roman sources talk about a city called Thebes, where silk comes from, that they're referring to China. But it's by no means certain that that is definitely the case, and we do not know of, as I say, of a single substantiated case of any merchant traveling along this route in the classical period. Now, if this story was true, you might expect to see evidence of it archaeologically. And so, as an interesting experiment, the Oxford Archaeological Department last year did a map based on Roman coin hoards. I think they define it as where there's more than 30 coins in a single discovery. And they mapped it. So now, if there really was Roman merchants passing backwards and forwards across Asia, you might expect a line of Roman coin hoards that reflect that map, a horizontal line across Asia. But look at what they actually came up with. A huge concentration, of course, of Roman coin hoards within the Roman Empire, so all over Spain, all over Gaul, all over southern Britain, Greece, around the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Where beyond that do we see Roman coins? Well, we see a little tail running down the Nile, very clearly. That was clearly a trade route where Roman coins were used. And we see a scattering around Ethiopia and Aden, a couple in northern Afghanistan, but look down in southern India. In southern India, in Sri Lanka, bright orange smudge full of Roman coin hoards. Why? Because Rome and India were each other's largest trading partner. We know that not only from the archaeology and the fact that there are more Roman coins found in India than any other place outside the Roman Empire, but also because we have the classical sources. Pliny calls India the drain of all the precious metals in the world. Strabo talks of fleets of 125 vessels in Myos Hormuz waiting to sail to India in a single fleet. When he visits the area to show the new Roman governor around, he actually sees 125 ships waiting to sail. And there's another port, Berenike, which is probably larger. So we're probably talking at least 250 vessels a year leaving India for China. Now, the reality is that although scholars are aware of this trade, the India-Roman route is not familiar to the general public at all. There's never been exhibitions that talk about it. There's never been Netflix series of some Roman sailor sailing off to India. And we've never seen a geopolitical thing like the Belt and Road built on top of it. And yet, this is substantiated in fact in archaeology and textual sources, while the Silk Road in the classical period is pure speculation. There is literally no hard evidence at all of direct routes running across the nation. That there was capillary action, that a single object could, in the course of several hundred years, pass from hand to hand and eventually make its way across the whole route, that's possible. But for most of this period, Persia is at war with Rome and then Byzantium, meaning that free passage was never easy and always problematic. And at some points, you even have Persian blockades stopping Roman shipping and so on passing. So the thesis in my book is that not only was not only was India far more important than China in the classical period as a center of East-West exchange, it's also not the overland route we should be looking at, it's the sea routes, which I call the Golden Road, after the enormous amount of gold which was passing backwards and forwards, which is referred to over and over again in the sources. And with that passage of merchants, you have the passage of Indian ideas. Well, you have that passage of ideas in both directions. It's during this period, for example, that Christianity reaches Kerala. We know there's a whole mythology built on St. Thomas. Whether St. Thomas did or not go to Kerala, certainly Christianity got there very early on. As we'll see later on in this lecture, there's now evidence that Buddhism came in reverse, and we found Buddhas in the Red Sea ports of Egypt, coming from India. So, India, not China, and over the seas, not over land. Those are the two central ideas. And that thirdly, that in the wake of this close passage, Indian ideas spread. What Indian ideas? Well, I've divided them in the book into three big headings. First, and possibly most substantially, the Indian ideas associated with Buddhism. Buddhism was the biggest soft power success of Indian culture, and it spread across the length of Asia. as we'll see. Secondly, the ideas of Hinduism, which became incredibly popular, along with Sanskritic culture and a whole range of Indic ideas in Southeast Asia a little bit later, in the 5th, 6th century onwards, leading ultimately to the largest Hindu temple in the world being built not in India, but in Angkor Wat in Cambodia. Extraordinary fact. Finally, and most importantly, I would argue, Indian ideas of mathematics, science, astronomy, astrology, which all are contained within a single subject of, in Sanskrit, Jyotisa, the study of science and the heavens. And that has given us one of the most important things in our civilization, which is the Indian number system, which we refer to in this country and in the West as the Arabic number system, because Europe gets it from the Arabs, but the Arabs get it from India. And we've forgotten where it came from, but the Arabs haven't. The Arabs call it the Hindu number system. And so the fact that you have a number system which with just 9 Indian symbols plus 0 can express any number up to infinity is India's gift to the world. Because once you've got those numbers and 0, you can do any number of fancy mathematical tricks, including place value, tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. Also binary, also algorithms, also algebra. And the Indian origins of all these are something we will gallop through in the next 20 minutes. But first of all, starting with Buddhism. Well, the first thing to be said is that obviously the Buddha was a historical character, mid-5th century BCE, born in Lumbini, just over the Nepal border from India, reaches enlightenment in Bodh Gaya in Bihar, preaches his first sermon at Sarnath outside Varanasi in modern Uttar Pradesh. Now, one of the interesting things about Buddhism is there's very little evidence for its spreading for the first 200 years, in contrast, say, to Islam or Christianity, which very rapidly spread across the Mediterranean and so on, and deep into the heart of Persia and the Levant. In fact, it's not until 250 BC, with the advent of the Emperor Ashoka. This is Ashoka's land capital at Sarnath, which is part of this whole world of Ashoka's pillar inscriptions. This is the moment Ashoka converts to Buddhism, encourages his people to do likewise, and sends what he calls Dharma ministers out beyond India, not only through India, but beyond, and they reach the world as far away as Cyrene, Libya. Inscription in Kandahar, which refers to the incredible spread of these Dharma ministers. So the world left fatherless by the death of Alexander the Great in Babylon, the different Greek generals such as Ptolemy and Antiochus and Seleucus, they receive Dharma ministers out of India. And this is one of the very first examples of a positive action leading to the spread of Indian ideas beyond the borders of India, something we're going to see a great deal of in the next 40 minutes. But it's in India that the effect is most dramatic. If initially you only see Buddhism in the Gangetic Plain, it spreads very rapidly down through Ajanta, through Bhaja and the wonderful rock-cut monasteries, to Sri Lanka. And Ashoka sends his son Mahinda to convert the king of Anuradhapura, and very quickly Sri Lanka becomes the center of the Buddhist mission. This is the stupa of Mahinda and the hill of Rajagala, recently rediscovered with the Brahmi inscription. And it's after this that you get the great miracle of Indian soft power, which is the spread of Buddhism. This is a map that we should all know. This extraordinary way that from that little oval pink over the Gangetic Plain, we have missions going not only south to Sri Lanka, but up through Gandhara and Afghanistan to Bactria, through Tibet to Dunhuang, Mongolia, and beyond the map to Siberia, through China to Chang'an, Korea, Japan, through Burma, Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia to the Philippines. I have to say I was slightly irritated by the whole setup of the Silk Road show here last year, which seemed to claim that the spread of Buddhism was somehow connected with China and was part of Chinese history, rather than obviously coming out of India and spreading specifically Indian ideas and being communicated in Indian languages, Prakrit and Sanskrit. And with it comes not just philosophies of how to avoid suffering and ideas of equality and non-violence, but also with it a whole package of Indian ideas about geography, about Jambudvipa, about time and yugas. These are inherent in Buddhism and spread across Asia, leading to this incredible transformation over a continental scale, all without the use of force. This is all soft power. No army transmits these Buddhist ideas. They get as far as Siberia, Japan, and the Philippines through the sheer sophistication and attractiveness of these ideas. And this is a fairly rare thing in world history. You can't point to many other examples of ideas transforming entire continents that are actually spread peacefully, not by force. It's a very, very wonderful and unique moment in world history. Now, at the same time as Buddhism is spreading, the trade routes and the monsoon winds are spreading Indian culture east and west. And we have, with this map, a series of ports visited by Roman sailors in a document called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. Now, it sounds a bit of a mouthful, but imagine this is just the Roman Lonely Planet for India, or the Rough Guide to India. It's written by a Roman sailor in the 1st century AD from Egypt, and he describes the places you can make some money. In Ethiopia, on the way, in Aksum, down the whole Red Sea route, but then gives detailed accounts of every port in West India. And this is in striking contrast to this complete absence of evidence for any contact with China at this period. Here we have not only evidence for trade, but trade so frequent that you need a guidebook for other sailors to follow it, and intimacy so profound that you actually have a sailor saying, for example, if you're going to Barigaza in Gujarat, pack castrati singing boys in your boat because the king of Gujarat likes to hear them. And you'll make a fortune if you sell them there. So he has detailed breakdown for each port of what you can sell, what you can make. The other useful thing of this map is just look at the scale of Tibet, the white plateau looming above India. Now, it is the freezing of Tibet in winter with the harsh winds, cold winds raking in, and then in the thaw in summer, the thaw, and warm winds blowing out over that vast scale. That is what creates the monsoon winds. That improbably gives India very punctual and very un-Indian wind timings. The Indian winds every May and June, I should say, blow out from the Indian coast in both directions. The east coast winds blow eastwards. The west coast winds blow westwards. And that's allowed, if you're an Indian sailor at this period, you just put up a sail and you're turbo-charged across the ocean. Once you've learnt to ride the monsoon, it's slightly like being, a surfer in Hawaii who learns to surf those enormous waves and be charged through the water. In the same way, if you can work out how to sail across the open water using these monsoon winds and not sink, you can be propelled in as little as 6 weeks from Kerala to the Red Sea coast of Egypt. You then have to get your goods to Alexandria, pump them up the Nile, go and see a show in Alexandria, visit the pyramids, do whatever you want to do, but you have to be back by the following autumn for when the winds reverse, and then you can be propelled back at equal speed towards India. So these winds are the secret of Indian trade. And archaeology has shown that not only is there this very familiar spread of Buddhism to Asia, where it remains, you still see Buddhist monks in Thailand, in Burma, in Sri Lanka. But also this turned up in the middle of writing this book. This is the Berenike Buddha, found on the Red Sea port of Berenike. It looks like it's Gandharan in style, but it's in white Proconnessian marble from the Marmara Sea. The tortellini curls, as the archaeologists call it, were clearly drilled apparently by a drill in use in Alexandria. and look at the weird sun rays billowing out of the Buddha's head. Some syncretism going on with Mithras or Surya or Sol Invictus. So this implies that not only were Buddhists, well, this shows that not only were Buddhist merchants from India reaching Egypt, but Buddhism was sufficiently familiar that workmen in Alexandria were able to produce a perfect Buddha image. And were aware enough of the iconography and the iconographical traits that they can use it, develop it, cross it with the sun god. And so this was something familiar, which raises a whole range of questions. For example, where does Christian monasticism begin? On the Red Sea coast with St. Anthony going to the caves in the 2nd century AD. This is the same time as this Buddha is carved, and it was this Buddha's head is found only 100 miles away from St. Anthony's monastery. Now, if Buddhist monks are familiar figures in 1st and 2nd century Egypt, are we not compelled to ask whether Christian monasticism is merely an outgrowth of Buddhist monasticism, which is 400 years old by this stage? Was it the example of Buddhist monks that made people do this unusual thing of going to live in a cave in the desert and live a life of asceticism and non-violence and vegetarianism? I think the vegetarianism is particularly interesting because it's not a Christian thing at all, but it's very specifically an Indian thing and an Indian Buddhist thing. Why would early Christian monks make a thing of their vegetarianism, which they do? And to this day, no matter it's vegetarian. Anyway, just some thoughts. So we know what was traveling in these merchant ships. The Mazaris papyrus, found probably at Oxyrhynchus, but now in Vienna, gives us figures for economic historians. And it's very clear that Indians were charging a lot for their goods. This is a wonderful mosaic in Sicily, which shows some of the things which were in the Mazaris papyrus consignment, because the Mazaris papyrus is just a shipping invoice, a random shipping invoice of one container leaving Kerala, heading for Alexandria. Ship has happened to survive and gives us the details and the prices and, surprisingly, the 30% tariffs. Where this is an oddly familiar phrase today, the 30% tariffs which the Romans were charging on Indian goods, and why they allowed the Indian trade to continue, because the Roman state was becoming enriched. Don't tell Trump how much money the Romans made out of it, because they did very well out of these tariffs. Anyway, the kind of thing that was on sale you can see in this mosaic in Sicily. What we have at the center is the representation of a personification of India, and she seems to be based on a yakshi from one of there's several fine examples in your show. Now, this is a symbol of fertility. The yakshis are tree spirits that represent fecundity and fertility. And it's not just that she is, the gorgeous young maiden, but look at what she's doing with her hand. She's touching the tree, and the tree, where she's touching it, is bursting into blossom. She's so fertile that when she touches the tree suddenly erupts into flower. Well, the Romans got the busty bit, but they didn't understand about what she was doing, and she said the Roman version is just holding on to a tree rather randomly, and there's no bursting of flower going on. But they got the busty bit right. And she is got pepper behind her. Pepper vines hanging down. She has got a tusk in her arm and another tusk on the rocks behind her. Ivory being the other most important thing in the Mazaris papyrus. Circus animals left and right for the Colosseum. Think of that rhino in Gladiator 2. This is the same sort of thing that's going on, heading for the Colosseum. And she has silk on her knees. And in the Mazaris papyrus and in the Periplus, silk is bought by the Romans from India. Now, if the Romans and the Chinese ever met, it was not on some non-existent Silk Road. It was on the quays of Gujarat, Sindh, or Kerala, because that was where the Romans went to buy their silk. We have it very clearly in the Periplus. And what's interesting is that you see how the silk is see-through. You can see her leg through the silk. So Pliny complains about this. Pliny, who's a conservative naval commander, he's everyone's sort of grumpy military uncle. he has a huge problem with the metropolitan elite, to use sort of, Fox News speak. The metropolitan elite buying that woke spice from abroad, pepper, or what Pliny regards as sort of Victoria's Secret pornoware in the form of the silk. He regards it as indecent fashion that the rich Roman ladies like turning up in parties wearing. And he had a point. We know, for example, that Lolina Paulina, who was a mistress of Nero, would turn up at parties wearing only a single wrap of silk through which you could see everything, to Pliny's conservative horror, with Indian diamonds in her hair, garnets in her tummy button, and Indian pearls on her shoes. And she brought the receipts to parties to show people how much it cost, in a nicely Punjabi touch. So all this... So this was all associated with urban elites. These were not, essential goods that Rome needed. These were the fancy things in duty-free that you buy when you have some extra money. So when you next get stuck in Heathrow and you end up buying that expensive Japanese whiskey or that unnecessary bottle of Hermes scent that you've emptied your bank account with, this is the equivalent of this. And Pliny is saying, we don't need all this foreign shit. We just need nice, straightforward olive oil, wine, and why does everyone have to buy all this stuff from India? So he's very upset. And he thinks that, as he says, the wealth of Rome is draining into Indian pockets. It is the drain of all the precious metals of the world. And once you start looking for Indian goods in excavations, they turn up. Here is the famous yakshi from Pompeii, but we're also got other goods coming in the opposite direction. So Roman Egypt is exporting fancy painted glass from Alexandria to, well, this is actually found under what became the American base at Bagram in Afghanistan. Sent to the mouth of the Indus, punted up the Indus and the Kabul River, and found Bagram near Kabul. And what have we got? We've got Russell Crowe on the left as gladiator, we've got the Pharos Lighthouse, and we've got the wine harvest. Now, most of the stuff I'm going to be talking about today is the influence of India on the rest of the world. But this is a very good moment to point out that, of course, these things go both ways. And what you have with the arrival of all this Roman art in India and Afghanistan and Pakistan is a Romanizing of some of the art. So in early Indian art, the Buddha is never shown except aniconically. And Sushma and Suresh have shown this very well in the show, with all these aniconic images. The Buddha represented as the wheel of law, or a flaming pillar, or a stupa. And this results in these very classical-looking Gandharan Buddhas, which look like Roman emperors. Look at the guy on the right. He looks like somebody's come off the Forum. So if you actually compare Augustus from the Forum with a Buddha from Peshawar, look at the drapery. Very, very similar. Absolutely, one is looking at the other. So it is under Roman influence that we get this very classicized Buddha. And what I haven't got on this slide deck, sadly, is a picture of the wonderful Bimaran reliquary, which is in the show, which is supposedly one of the first images of the Buddha in human form, wearing a toga, hint, and looking like Apollo. So it is this sort of mixed Buddha which travels up through Afghanistan into China, and from the 1st century AD, you begin to get these Gandharan images, but with slightly sinicized features. The Buddha now looking rather more Chinese than he does Indian. So Buddhism arrives in the 1st century AD initially as a religion of foreigners, but quickly makes inroads, particularly initially in Western China. So we see images from Mathura being sort of copied in Gansu by the 3rd or 4th century. Shortly afterwards, we get these amazing wall paintings, very much in the spirit of Ajanta, with Indian Gandharvas and Apsaras floating over domes. And by the 5th century, Buddhism has arrived on the Indian court and driven its tanks onto the lawns of the Confucians and the Taoists, neither of whom are welcoming them at all and are feeling very much under competition from the Buddhists. So the man who helps Buddhism get its great breakthrough is Xuanzang. Xuanzang is this nerdy Buddhist scholar from Xi'an, from Chang'an, who is convinced that all the monastic rules in China have been corrupted by bad translation. And he He also wants to find the Yogacara texts, which are these important Mahayana texts. He can't get them in China, so he goes all the way to Nalanda, the great university of India. And look at the central courtyard of Nalanda. A court, a cloister garth, scholars' rooms on 2 stories. Where do you find that? Oxford and Cambridge. Think of I don't know, Magdalen College, Oxford, or Trinity College, Cambridge. This is exactly the plan. Now, you can make a scholarly case that this plan starts in Nalanda, or in Taxila, or in the northwest frontier, spreads through the madrasas of Islam, crossing North Africa, and first appears via Islamic Spain, on the edge of Islamic Spain, in Salerno, Bologna, Paris, and then comes to Oxford and Cambridge. Whether or not that is the case, and I argue that in the book, Nalanda is this extraordinary institution, the Alexandrian Library of Asia. 9 stories of manuscripts set in 3 divisions. You can study the Vedas, logic, grammar, philosophy, medicine, metaphysics, divination, mathematics, Sanskrit, astronomy, literature, and magic. The numbers of the monks to several thousands. From morning until night, they engage in discussions. The old and the young mutually help each other. Lectures are given in 100 different halls each day, and the students study diligently without wasting a moment. The atmosphere in the monastery was solemn and dignified. So Xuanzang comes from China, he arrives in Nalanda, and he spends 20 years copying out manuscripts, particularly the Yogacara texts. But he's got so many by the time he leaves that the King Harsha gives him some horses to help them get them home, and he gets most of them back to China. The only exception is 1 boatload which goes down in the Indus when he's crossing an Attic. Just before we go to China again, this is a copper plate now in Delhi showing that Nalanda had scholarly donations from as far away as Indonesia. This is the King of Srivijaya giving 100 villages produce to Nalanda to found an expatriate monastery for Southeast Asian monks. And we know of other monks coming from Nepal, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Sumatra, and even Korea. So this is not an India overshadowed by China. This is India, at this point, at the heart of Asia, the scholarly center to which monks and lay people come to study in India. Nalanda is the Harvard, the Oxbridge, the NASA of its day. And at this period, everyone is coming to India to study. And Xuanzang says very clearly, India is the country we most admire, India is the country where it's all at. So there's a perception at this point that India is the intellectual hub of things. Now, this pilgrim seal on the right may show the Nalanda library. Some people think it represents Bodh Gaya, which it could do, but it may well represent the library before it was destroyed at Bodh Gaya. And when Xuanzang goes back to Chang'an, the Emperor Taizong, who's this guy on the left, builds a copy of it in Xi'an, which is still standing, the Wild Goose Pagoda. And the manuscripts brought by Xuanzang are placed there, as are the translations which develop. Now, Xuanzang doesn't mention her at first, but the woman that's going to change everything for him is this 15-year-old princess who becomes the mistress of Taizong. And she doesn't look like much in the woodcut, it's true, but she manages to pivot from the bed of Taizong, the emperor, to the bed of Gaizong, the next emperor. And you can see how she does this slightly more clearly in the Chinese soap opera, where she's a rather more winsome figure than in the woodcut. But the important point about her, not to dwell on her too much, is that she basically brings about the conversion of China to Buddhism. The Chinese court, for the length of her reign, converts to Buddhism. Her reign as the only woman emperor in 3,000 years of Chinese history is confirmed by a whole series of Buddhist prophecies, which are trumped up slightly by the Buddhist monks, claiming she's the reincarnation of Maitreya and all manner of other stuff. But they use this as a way of putting a woman onto the throne, which is something forbidden by Confucian ideas. And this if you like, is the high watermark of Indian influence, the moment that an Indian religion takes over the court of China, even if it's only for one generation. Of course, Buddhism remains extremely important in China for the rest of history, and today most Buddhists in the world are in China. But this is the moment when we are at the high watermark of that. Now, the same sort of thing is happening at the same time in Southeast Asia, but this time it's Hinduism which is dominant. We talked about all that trade between Rome and India in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century. Now, what happens when Rome collapses? In 410, the Goths sack Rome. Initially, they ask for a payment, and they're paid in black pepper from India. But eventually, Rome is burnt, and the chaos which erupts as the Huns follow the Goths, as the Vandals follow the Huns, and all these different peoples spread across Europe, is that the Red Sea trade packs up, Berenike and Myas Hormuz are abandoned, and suddenly the treasure ships which have been shipping great tons of gold to India cease to arrive. Now, what happens in India is that the trading guilds, particularly an amazing guild called the 500, which is a bit like a non-fiction version of the Iron Bank in Game of Thrones. The 500 are these incredible guild that has its own corps of assassins, according to one inscription, that has its own army, that has its own guards, has its own navy, and these guys pivot eastwards. And as there's no gold arriving from the west, they find it where? In what they come to call Savarna Bhumi, by which they mean Southeast Asia. If you go on your in your Christmas holidays to Thailand and land at Bangkok, you land at Savarna Bhumi Airport. It just means the lands of gold, so named at this point as the Indians were coming searching for gold. Where? In places like Palembang in Sumatra, Kutai in Borneo, Keling in Java, Bujang in Malaysia, where Suresh and I have a mutual friend digging up these very early and extraordinary Indian trading settlements. And Indian merchants are traveling in boats like this, and here is some of the objects that our friend dug up in Bujang. Dr. Nasha found wonderful lingams and yonis and images of Lord Shiva. This is slightly earlier Buddhist monk. But one of the biggest settlements at this time of Indian merchants in Southeast Asia is the Mekong Delta, particularly the site of Ok Eo, now in Vietnam, but looking on to the Cambodian Delta. And if you go across the canals and land at Ashram Maharose, you find yourself in the first Hindu temple in Southeast Asia. Inside that temple were found these incredible images of Vishnu, which already are showing signs of Cambodianization, if you like. He's wearing a sampot, his physiognomy is Cambodian. And within a generation or two, we're finding odd iconographical developments. So look on the top right, that is Jayavarman II, who founds the Angkor dynasty, but he's got 4 arms, and he's holding a conch and a discus. In other words, he's been transformed into a figure of Lord Vishnu. He is a Devraja, the god king. Now, you don't find this in India. In India, you often have images of, say, Rajaraja Chola with Lord Shiva, but you never find Rajaraja Chola as Lord Shiva. And this is the beginning of a series of developments in Hinduism in Southeast Asia, whereby Hinduism in Southeast Asia has no caste, often has female Brahmins officiating in temples, which never happens in India, and eats, for example, pork and beef. So it's Hinduism, but not quite the Hinduism that we know in India. It sounds a rather nice Hinduism. I could do with casteless women, Brahmins, feeding me pork and beef. That sounds a very nice way of developing your religion. Anyway, so this is the sort of thing that's going on. You have a local king, let's call him Kodunga, which is a name we have in one inscription, and he's sitting under a little canopy, and a bunch of guys, look, they've just run away from the Kumbh Mela, all these sadhus with their top knots and their Brahmin's cords, all holding pots, are pouring pots of water over him. It's not because it's hot and he hasn't, and the British Museum doesn't have proper AC and not enough fans. It's because this is the Abhisheka ceremony, which is the Hindu kingship ritual that is the equivalent of the anointing of kings in Judeo-Christian chrism, in the Judeo-Christian regalia. And suddenly this guy who was called, let's say, Kudunga becomes, let's say, Suryavarman. He has a Sanskrit name. And these Brahmins are bringing not only the promise of support with the gods, you're suddenly the friend of Lord Krishna, Lord Shiva, Lord Vishnu, but also practical help, because the Brahmins are literate. They have administered kingdoms in Pallava kingdoms in Southeast Asia. One of the things they bring is the Pallava Grantha script, Southern Brahmi. North Indian scripts, as I'm sure you all know, have the straight line from which the letters come down like a washing line. But South Indian scripts, which are drawn on palm leaf, are curvilinear, because you can't do the straight line on a palm leaf or you cut it. So they develop a script which is rounded, and this script is the mother or father of both Malayalam and Tamil, but also in Southeast Asia, Mon, Khmer, Thai, Pew. The Southeast Asian, all the Southeast Asian scripts up to the advent of Islam. And at the same time, we see a transformation of the landscape. So a new Ayodhya, the capital of Lord Ram, is built outside Bangkok. A new Kurukshetra, the great battle of the Mahabharata, is built outside Laos. And we have a development of the landscape, so that the holy rivers suddenly become holy rivers of India by the carving of lingams and yonis at the headwaters near the spring where they emerge. And the etymology is sometimes contested, but there is a renaming, many scholars would say, of the central river of Southeast Asia after the Ganges, or Ma Ganga, or as it's pronounced in Khmer, Mekong. Mekong. So you have an entire landscape transformed, and into that landscape suddenly emerge the cupulas and the spires and the shikaras of Hindu temples. So on the left we have the Shore Temple in Mahabalipuram, and on the right, Gedong Songo in Java, very similar. Not identical, but 5 years later and clearly referring to the first. And very soon after that, we begin to see bigger temples being built in Southeast Asia than are being built in India. Why? Because India remains divided. India has a clear sense of its own sense as a geographical and cultural region, but it's always politically divided. When Xuanzang enters India, he says, I'm coming into India, a land of 70 kingdoms. And those 70 kingdoms continue to compete and fight with each other. Pallavas against Cheras, Cheras against Cholas, Cholas against... help me, Suresh, wasn't it? Well, Chalukyas against Rashtrakutas. But in Southeast Asia, you get two mega powers at this point. The whole of Southeast Asia, the islands are Srivijaya, while the mainland increasingly is the Khmer Empire, spilling out of Cambodia through Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand. As a result of this, you get Prambanam on the right, the largest 9th century temples then being built, and in it, the 240-part strip cartoon, if you like, of the Ramayana, 400 years before a similar one is made at Hampi. This is an Indian story. It comes out of India, but it's carved in toto for the first time, not in India, but in Java. Similarly, in Java, we have Borobudur, arguably the largest and most sophisticated Buddhist monument of its day. And finally, we get Angkor Wat itself, the largest medieval monument of any sort on earth, the largest Hindu temple, and so large that the outer moat contains an area 4 times the size of the Vatican City. But it is no longer clearly the same as anything in India. When Tagore goes there, he says, everywhere I could see India, yet I could not recognize her, by which he means that these are Indian seeds, and yet scattered in foreign soil, they're producing different fruit. And there's nothing quite like Angkor Wat anywhere in India. Particularly this quincunx plan with 5 spires, and the center containing the ashes of the builder Suryavarman II. Now, you never get the ashes of a Hindu king in the center of a temple. You have it in the ghats outside or in the Chatri. But here it's at the center, like a Buddhist stupa. So things are, developing on their own trajectory. So we're nearly rushing out of time, and forgive me, Sushma and Suresh, for taking more time than I should have done. But quickly, the final and most important bit of India's legacy to the world, which are numbers. And here you can all read it, 270. How come you can read Indian numbers from the 10th century? So, the Gupta kings were the great mathematician, patronized the great mathematicians of their day. Aryabhatta comes up with the exact circumference of the Earth, the distance of the Earth to the Moon, and the fact we are in a heliocentric universe 1,000 years before Galileo. His follower, Brahmagupta, comes up with definitions of zero, which realizes that zero is not an absence or a placeholder between positive and negative. It is a number with its own features, with its own powers. And added to the 9 Indian number symbols, it allows you, as I said at the beginning, to express any number up to infinity. And here we have the world's first zero, second line, middle between the two tadpoles, K127 from Siem Reap. This is the world's first zero. A couple of centuries later, on the bottom right, the polo mint-shaped zero we use today, the first dated example of that in the world. Now, how come that Indian numbers are so familiar to us? Look at that 270 in the middle. Well, here's the answer. And this should be taught in every school because it's one of the basic moments of human civilization. This is right up there, certainly with Pythagoras and Pi or Archimedes shouting Eureka, and yet no one in this country who isn't Indian has ever heard of Aryabhatta or Brahmagupta. It's a major omission in our education. So you start off with Brahmi in the 1st century, 6 and 7s already looking quite familiar. Then you have the Gwalior inscription by the 10th century. And then it goes into 3 different directions. The Sanskrit numbers continue looking like that. The East Arabic numbers used in Iraq, in Egypt, in Syria, so on, look like that. But it's the ones on the left that you must focus on, because those West Arabic numbers developed in Morocco and Islamic Spain by the 15th century, looking very familiar, and by the 16th century are our numbers. Now that, you'd have thought, is something that any kid anywhere in the world should learn, but almost no one does, even in India. It's India's most important gift to the world, and none of us know it comes from India. As far as kids in the West are aware of it at all, it's Arabic numbers who is presumed came from the Arabs. It did come from the Arabs, but they got it from here, from India first. But how does it get to the Arabs? Well, probably through a Disney character. This is Jafar from the Disney Aladdin. He is a historic character. Jafar was a Barmakid vizier of Baghdad. Jafar is from a family of Buddhist abbots in Afghanistan who convert to Islam and rise in the ranks of the Abbasid revolution by their facility with numbers. They control the army accounts, and they do it so successfully that at the end of the war, they're made viziers of Baghdad. In fact, they plan Baghdad. Baghdad is their creation. And 4 successive generations of this family are the viziers who control the great Abbasid Empire that stretches from Spain, or from Gibraltar, what's the opposite Gibraltar? In Morocco. Come on, what's the bit of Morocco that looks onto Gibraltar? Anyway, whatever it is, that's from there right through to the Indus. The final one is Jafar, who is the vizier of Harun al-Rashid, and who is in the Disney Aladdin because he's a major figure in the Arabian Nights. And he cavorts around Baghdad at night in disguise with Harun al-Rashid, who likes going out and going to the brothels and the bars and enjoying all the delights of Baghdad in mufti, in disguise. As soon as the Barmakids get to power, the first thing they do is they send to the nearest Hindu kingdom, which is Sindh, for copies of the books of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta. And it arrives in 776 with a delegation. The volume seems to be Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta bound into a single volume. The Arabs call it the Great Sindh Hind. And with that same embassy also come the works of Charaka, or something certainly very like the works of Charaka, the beginning of Ayurvedic medicine, which is also brought to Baghdad. It's received in state by the Barmakids, but it's a couple of generations before a really good translation is made, because not only are Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta incredibly dense, the Sanskrit is actually poetry, so it can be memorized by children, and it is so obtuse that unless you've got all the Vedic references and know a whole range of Indian, you can't make head or tail of it. And the first translation by an Arab geographer called Al-Fazari is only adequate at best. The great breakthrough comes the next generation when a guy called Al-Khwarizmi does his version of it. And here is the map, just to show you. Sind is on the right, Baghdad is in the middle, Khwarazm, where Al-Khwarizmi comes from, is up above the Aral Sea. And he does his translation, which spreads through Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Spain, and eventually reaches a monastery outside Barcelona by the 9th century. And that's the beginning of Indian numbers in Europe. Now, this is the book which does that travel. It's given the snappy title of the Compendious Book of Calculation by Completion and Balancing According to Hindu Calculation. Now, that's even more of a mouthful in Arabic, so everyone knows it just by a nickname, algebra. Algebra. That's where the word algebra comes from. And the guy who writes the book, Al-Khwarizmi, is the basis of our word algorithm. So algebra and algorithms are both from this meeting of the Indic world with the Islamic world. Now, for the next 2 centuries, it spreads all the way to Barcelona. But despite the fact that one of the early popes, Pope Sylvester, studies in the monastery of Ripoll and takes these numbers to Rome, they don't catch on. And Pope Sylvester is kicked out of Rome and accused of being a Saracen sorcerer, partly because of using all this Arabic learning. So for the next 2 centuries, everyone in Europe continues to use MCXV1, CCXVM, all those Latin numbers that the BBC put at the end of each program, and we could never quite work out what date each program was made. Try giving your phone number to someone in Arabic numbers. It takes about half an hour. Never mind doing long multiplication or division. Luckily for us, you see Pisa on the top left of Italy. Well, Pisa, as in the Leaning Tower, trading port, decides to found a colony in Algeria. And they found a colony in Bujaya, and they send a senior merchant who brings his kids. Kids go to school locally. They learn Arabic, and they learn Al-Khwarizmi's maths, which is then being taught as just standard mathematical textbook everywhere in the Islamic world. Luckily for us, the guy who read that went back to Pisa, found his friends still using MCV, XV1, and all the rest of it, and who writes this book of the Compendious Book of Calculation by Completion. The guy who takes this book to Italy and translates it into Latin as the Liber Abaci is none other than Fibonacci. And it's Fibonacci who brings these numbers to Europe. Luckily also for us, here's his book. Luckily also for us, he had one of the most enlightened kings of his day, who was Frederick II. Frederick II comes up to Pisa, quizzes Fibonacci, and then invites him to his wonderful castle, Castel del Monte in Puglia, which is one of the most beautiful castles on the Italian coast. And there, very importantly, he introduces him to a Scotsman. This is the great moment that the Scots come into this story. And Michael Scott from Melrose in the Scots borders has gone to Toledo, learnt Arabic, translated Arabic texts, and been promoted to be the head of the astronomy and astrology section at the Holy Roman Court in Palermo. He reads Fibonacci's Liber Abaci, realizes it's a work of genius, but also realizes that, as he puts it, it's a wee bit theoretical. So he then says you should add weights and measures, usury, interest rates, double accounting, money conversions, a whole range of practical applications of this math so that merchants can use it. And Fibonacci is modest enough to take the advice and produces a second edition with all this practical stuff thrown in. And that text becomes the basis of the Italian Revolution in banking. The Medici Bank is founded using the Arabic numbers and Fibonacci's maths. It spreads to Tuscany, where Piero della Francesca, famous for the flagellation in Urbino, writes 3 mathematical treatises based on Fibonacci, one of which is all about the use of numbers, these number systems to calculate perspective and the basis of Renaissance painting. Then Fibonacci dies, and his 3 mathematical texts are carried by his friend Fra Luca Pacioli to Milan, where he shares it with his flatmate, who's a jobbing painter, who at that point is painting a picture of the Last Supper in a monastery in Milan, Leonardo da Vinci. So you get from Leonardo to Fibonacci, to Piero, Piero to Fibonacci, Fibonacci to Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Khwarizmi to Brahmagupta, Brahmagupta to Aryabhata. 5 steps takes you from Gupta India to Leonardo and the Renaissance. Unfortunately, the next thing that happens is he reaches England and we get the East India Company, but that's a different story for a different day. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think that's absolutely wonderful. There are obviously very clear links between William's wonderful book and the exhibition itself. And I'd say they're very complementary. And in fact, I suppose the exhibition and the book that Suresh and I wrote, it kind of tells the slightly earlier phase of this story. Because why do you recognize an image of the Buddha? Where did that come from? What about the images of the Jain enlightened teachers? What about the images of the Hindu deities? All of which, as William has so wonderfully shown, found themselves in Southeast Asia, you know, along the other roads all the way through to China, Central Asia, and many other parts of the world. And I'm going to hand over to Suresh for a few minutes just to expand on that bit of the story.
So just as is the case with William's Golden Road, the exhibition had its own Golden Road. We explored the dissemination of Indian ideas and imagery to Central Asia, to China, Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia as well. And more importantly, tell the story of how these Indian ideas were localized. They were adapted. It was not a wholesale sort of imposition on these cultures. They were received and interpreted in different ways. And also in the case of China, for example, most of the Buddhist scripture is in Chinese. There were Sanskrit texts translated into Chinese, and there were Chinese texts that were composed anew. And when Buddhism gets transmitted to Japan and Korea, they're transmitted through the medium of Chinese. And in Southeast Asia, again, you see lots of examples of localization, as William has pointed out as well. If you go to this site in northern Cambodia called Sambor Praikok, absolutely wonderful site that William's been to as well, filled with dozens of Hindu temples, but they look nothing like the Hindu temples you find in India. They are 8-sided octagonal temples, which are prescribed in some Indian texts, but we never actually have a proper example of it in India. So architecturally, they're quite diverse as well, as you also saw with the case with Angkor Wat.
Wonderful, and I'm just going to, in just 2 minutes, bring that story back, quite a few hundred years, because the origins of this incredible imagery begins with the nature spirits of the subcontinent. And just as the stories that William described in his talk...
The musty girl from... we showed inspiring the mosaic in Sicily. That's a Yakshi.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, just taking on with that. I mean, the Yakshis, the female nature spirits, you see that imagery all over. You see it with Hindu deities, you see it with the Apsaras, and it's the voluptuous female embodying the ideas of fertility and plenty, always draped in rich jewelry. They're often holding flowers, sitting on flowers. That imagery, it's unchanged for over 2,000 years. And so these earliest artists, over 2,000 years ago, shaped all of these nature spirits into human form.
And that image that I showed of the Yakshi touching the tree, or kicking the tree in some other versions, and the tree blossoming into flower, appears in Mughal art, in Pahari art, in late Mughal art in Lucknow and so on, and in the Rajput courts. So it's an image which just goes on from culture to culture.
Absolutely, and I think that's what's so fascinating about this early Indian imagery. Not only is it, found cross-culturally and globally today, but also it just hasn't changed all that much in over 2 millennia, which is really incredible when you think about the success of these early artistic imagery. I mean, if you saw just a plain outline of the Buddha, you expect to see, the curls on the head, the elongated ears, and maybe even the sacred protrusion on the top of the head. You see those three. If you see just those three bits of an outline, you immediately know who you're looking at. And I think that's genuinely incredible when you think about that. I wanted to open up the floor to questions. We've got a few minutes, and I'd love anyone who has questions to stick your hand up and ask. Yes, please.
Apparently there are 1 or 2 Jain images in Southeast Asia, but it is 1 or 2.
I wonder if obviously there are probably more Buddhist art scholars in the world than there are Jain art scholars in the world. And, we did touch on this very slightly in the book, but I wonder if actually not a lot, but a certain number of the Buddhist images that we see and that have been ascribed to be Buddhist images, I wonder if actually some of them are Jain, because actually there are so many similarities. I mean, the origins of this art is the same. Obviously, the religions aren't. There are key differences. So I wonder if actually a lot of them have actually been misidentified. And if you were to reappraise the ones found, in Central Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, whether you might actually find potentially more images.
Suresh, that there's a Jain image in Tashkent or somewhere.
In Central Asia, in Kyrgyzstan, there's some medieval period Jain images, but they appear to be part of a diasporic mercantile community who brought their images over. But by and large, it's not as popular as Buddhism. Maybe there might be some, theological reasons for why it wasn't particularly appealing.
It's harder.
Well. Yeah.
Jainism is more austere, and the Buddha comes up with what he calls the middle way, because you have all these people at his period of history starving themselves to death, doing salakana, plucking their beards out hair by hair, plucking their heads out hair by hair. It's a deliberately very, very tough path, the Jain path, and Buddhism is the kind of is the easier route, the middle way.
There's also Buddhism was at that very early period was very closely associated with trading activity. Yeah. Exactly.
So Suresh is a great expert in travelling peppercorns and mummy noses.
So the reference being made here is to the body of Ramesses II, in whose nostrils were found these peppercorns. And they are, large macro remains that were not, they were not inserted into his nostrils like, in modern times. They were part of the ancient body when it was investigated in Paris. There was nicotine found in the body. There were traces of tobacco, and that's because people suspected that some of the people who were charged with conserving that body were probably smoking around it or somewhere in the vicinity of it. And there was a study published about it. So we have to be careful with some biological studies because there is a lot of contamination, especially like, for example, ancient protein studies, for example, produce a lot of results of modern day contamination. There was soybean reported from Bronze Age Megiddo in Israel, for example. And soybeans are Chinese domesticate. It doesn't make sense why it traveled to Bronze Age, the Middle East. Yeah.
Well, on the note of the unexpected note of peppercorns up a pharaoh's nose, I think we'll draw today to a close. I want to say a huge thank you to Professor Muthukumaran and especially to William Dalrymple. Thank you very much.